Okay, this is our last session, and again, please give a free will offering on your way out. Lunch, after our responsive prayer, lunch will be in the cafeteria. We appreciate the women of faith and their providing snacks, and also for the lunch today too as well. And if anybody's able to take the speaker to the airport this afternoon, let me know. Okay. You got a couple? Okay, good, great. All right, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my suitcase came in, I think, and so the 4 copies of the book on Lewis's conversion from atheism to Christianity are in there. If anybody wants to see me, I'll take that. It's right here. Oh. So I wanted to get something else out of there. This church or another church, some brochures that our church relations guy put together on church work majors, and the backside has some info about Concordia University, Texas. There we go. Okay. So use those here or elsewhere as a bulletin insert or as just a handout. Maybe to anybody that came here that wants one, they can take that. At any rate, first 2 sessions were about a lot of the biblical data in support of creation. This last session is going to demonstrate many of the places of weakness of evolutionary thinking. Excuse me. Creation, science, and evolution, last topic for today. So just to remind you, St. Louis, June 14 to 15, registration at www.societyofcreation. It says .com, but I think it's .org. And that's a mistake. Click on the conference link, scroll down. Here's the theme, Thousands Not Billions, How Old is the Earth? Keynote speakers from Answers in Genesis, that creation organization Ken Ham heads up just south of Cincinnati, Terry Mortensen, and geologist Andrew Snelling. I spent a week in the Grand Canyon with those 2 guys and a couple dozen other people back in 2012. We floated down the Colorado River and then stopped at various places, and Andrew Snelling described us a lot of the geology that demonstrates that the Grand Canyon was laid down rapidly after the flood of Noah, and how that all happened, and how certain features of the Grand Canyon can only be explained by rapid deposition following a flood rather than the millions of years that the Grand Canyon is supposed to have developed over. But anyway, that's Snelling. He's a geologist. So we're going to look at some of the major flaws of Darwinism. Got this tickle in my throat. I don't think I'm sick. Feel fine. Origin of life, where'd that come from? Nobody knows. Lack of transitional forms in the fossil record, supposed to show one creature evolving into another. The lack of increased information in mutations. Mutations are always harmful or neutral. The lack of a complete geological column. The complexity of the cell. This is sort of a spin-off of the previous one. The irreducible complexity of many cell and body systems. The existence of live fossils, fossils that are discovered that were thought to be extinct, and we have now found some of them still alive today. Older rock layers on top of younger layers, folded layers in the rock. Rock doesn't bend real easily when it's dry, but when it's wet, that's another story after a flood. Mutations always harmful. And some of the distortion of the evidence has been used in time past to support the theory of evolution, only to find out that it was bogus information in the first place. So part 1 is going to look at some of the assumptions. Part 2, some obsolete arguments. And then part 3, some evidences. So this is a famous quotation that's in the little book that 4 of you picked up in the beginning, God. But Lewontin is showing the bias of evolutionists, many evolutionists, and they take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated stories because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. So it's really, in many ways, a philosophical or religious commitment. He says at the end, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Richard Lewontin. C.S. Lewis once wrote, if the solar system was brought about by an accidental collision, then the appearance of organic life on this planet was also an accident, and the whole evolution of man was an accident. If so, then all our thought processes are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms, and this holds for the materialists and astronomers as well as for anyone else's. But if their thoughts, that is, of materialism and astronomy, are merely accidental byproducts, why should we believe them to be true? I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give a correct account of all the other accidents. So anyway, that's C.S. Lewis. He bought into some of the ideas of evolution, but later on in life he seemed to have a turnabout, but he was a bit hesitant to come out completely on the position that he held. Physicist H.P. Yaki, research on the origin of life seems to be unique in that the conclusion has already been authoritatively accepted. What remains to be done is to find the scenarios by which the detailed mechanisms and processes by which this happened. In other words, we believe in evolution. There is life, so it must have begun somewhere, somehow. We just haven't found out how it happened yet. That's very convenient. One must conclude that contrary to the established and current wisdom, a scenario describing the genesis of life has to be accepted by faith. Stephen Jay Gould, famous evolutionist, to preserve our favorite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad we never see the very processes we profess to study. So there are a lot of evolutionists that from time to time are very frank and honest about the problems with their positions, but you don't hear too much about that in the press today. Astronomer says, and this isn't a quotation from an actual astronomer, but many secular astronomers will talk this way. Any day, we'll pick up a tiny coded signal, then we'll know for certain that there is intelligence out there because coded information does not arise by chance. Microbiologists, the precisely coded information in each cell would fill many books, but we know for certain that no intelligence created life. This was actually a cartoon that Stephen Cardinal put together, sort of a contradiction there, as you can see, and laugh at it. Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, atheist, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. I'll buy that, except get rid of the word almost. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. First living cell. Nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell. Frank admission by an Australian. Now this was going to blow your mind. Edward Tryon, City University of New York. The universe created itself spontaneously out of nothing as a result of established principles of physics. You can't make this stuff up. Alex Valenkin, Tufts University near Boston. The universe, as a young bubble, had tunneled like a metaphysical mole from somewhere else to arrive in space and time. That someplace else was nothing. Edward Kolb, Fermi National Accelerator Lab near Chicago. Even when you have nothing, there's something going on. I didn't write this, thank God. So give Kolb an A in creative writing, but an F in logic, okay? I'm a college professor, so I can assign grades. Carl Sagan, the famous Cornell University evolutionist. The cosmos is all that is, there ever was, or ever will be. That's very naturalistic philosophy, very famous statement that Carl Sagan said, and probably some of you have heard that. Newsweek, 1988. In the greatest leap of imagination, most cosmologists now believe that the universe arose from nothing and that nothing is as certain to give rise to something as the night is to sire the dawn. Okay, again, very creative. What is chance? Think about this for a moment. Chance is not the cause of anything, like it's some power of the universe. It's not a being, it's not an energy, it's not mass, power, intelligence, not even an entity. Chance is a retrospective, that's after the fact description of how something happened, that something occurred without planning. So you and I meeting today might be chance. Certainly I planned to be here, Pastor Wilmer invited me here, but maybe you hadn't planned to be here until a few days ago, and then all of a sudden the schedule opened up and you were here. That was chance that happened, but it wasn't that 6 months ago you and I both knew we were going to be here on this occasion. So there are chance describes some things, but they're always after the fact how things happen to happen. Sir Edward Eddington, the law of entropy is time's arrow flying in the wrong direction. So evolution says things are gradually getting better and better and more complex. The law of entropy says things are gradually breaking down and getting worse and more random, like my front yard, remember? So evolutionists say it has to be going in the opposite direction to get better. R.H. Rastall, it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of organisms that they contain. So we date, this is in World Book Encyclopedia in my library at Concordia, 2 different articles in 2 different volumes. One says we date the age of the fossils by the age of the rock layers that we find them in. Another article, another volume, we date the age of the rock layers on the basis of the age of the fossils that are found in them. That's what we call circular logic. There's no fixed point outside of the rock layers and the fossils, which Rastall admits. Erwin Rudolf Joseph Alexander Schrödinger, whence come I and whither I go? That is the great unfathomable question. Same for every one of us. Science has no answer to it. That's why we have the Bible, because it's got the answers. Schrödinger also says science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we are not inclined to take them seriously. So he at least is aware of the fact that science can't answer ultimate questions. Where did I come from? Who do I belong to? Where am I heading? Why am I here? Evolutionists often define evolution as change. Also common for evolutionists to equate microevolution, changes within species, to macroevolution, changes into new species. Creationists have never disputed microevolution. People on average are taller today than they were 500 years ago. If you don't believe that, we have a statue on our campus at Concordia University of Martin Luther, true to life, based upon his skeletal remains, what he probably looked like when he was a college student in 1505. And you know our images of Martin Luther. He was thin at that time, still in college, a little bit more corpulent later on in life. I'm tall next to Martin Luther. And so we have this idea, of course, this larger-than-life figure from the pages of history, especially Lutheran history, and here's Martin Luther. He's about this tall. They had to put him on a pedestal so he wouldn't look quite so diminutive. That's microevolution. That's fine. I'm with that, but not macro. Geneticists can approach macroevolutionary phenomena only by inference from the known microevolutionary ones. And they often argue if you put enough small changes together, you get a big change, but you don't get change from one species to another. Gary Parker, creationist from years ago, in one graduate class, the professor told us we didn't have to memorize the dates of the geological systems since they were far too uncertain and conflicting. Then in geophysics, we went over all the assumptions that go into radiometric dating. Afterwards, the professor said something like this: if a fundamentalist ever got hold of this stuff, he would make havoc out of the radiometric dating system. So keep the faith. Gary Parker, creationist, talking about what he learned in graduate school. And one of the topics at the conference in St. Louis this summer is going to be Andrew Snelling talking about radiometric dating, by the way, a geologist. Charles Darwin, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive, hence slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. He says that in Origin of Species. They had not known any transitional fossils at the time that Darwin wrote and published The Origin of Species. And so he was arguing that once the fossil record was well known, there would be hundreds of intermediate species between, say, this small horse-like creature that later on evolved into the great horses and racehorses of today. And the fossil record doesn't demonstrate that. If you want to read something that deals with the impossibility of that quotation of Darwin being documented, read Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. I still remember how he describes the clotting factor, the way in which the human body, the blood system, results in a blood clot after you cut yourself. About 13 successive steps that are so complex you can't imagine them possibly happening by chance. Part 2. They used to say 1770 the Earth was 70,000 years old. 1905 Newsweek said 2 billion. 1955 5.5 billion. Today most scientists 4.6 billion. J.B.S. Haldane, I mentioned at the break to some of you, was an atheist, evolutionist, and expert in biology and in mathematics. He came up with what he calls Haldane's dilemma. He said it takes 300 generations, and he's thinking from the evolutionary point of view, for a positive mutation to become sufficiently embedded in a population so that it becomes characteristic of that population. 300 generations. Now what if we have a living creature for whom a generation is 20 years? 300 generations, that's 20 years times 300, that's 6,000 years for one helpful mutation to lead from this creature to that. And how many hundreds of mutations are necessary for a new creature to evolve, for a dinosaur to evolve, even a small one, to evolve into a bird? There's not enough time, even in 10 times as much, as many years as evolutionists claim the universe existed. So this is George Gamow, Modern Cosmology, 1955, periodical The New Astronomy. Junk DNA. Talked about this a little bit. Our DNA is far more complex than we ever thought. It has far more functions, codes for more proteins. We have only about 20,000 genes, yet we're able, with our human body, our DNA, to create more than 100,000 different proteins. So our DNA is multifunctional, at least 6 different ways in which our DNA is functional. And so this, Jonathan Wells of the Discovery Institute out of Seattle wrote a book a few years ago called The Myth of Junk DNA. Since Francis Collins headed up the Human Genome Project, and then subsequently Project ENCODE did its work, there are scientists that are now saying 80% or more of our DNA is functional. And I think, because I know who designed it, we're probably going to one day decide it's 100% functional. So that doesn't mean, therefore, that 90% of our DNA has no purpose. It's just evolutionary leftovers from earlier stages of our development where our DNA can do things that we no longer need, and that's proof of DNA, or of evolution, that the term junk DNA doesn't get used anymore in even evolutionary circles. Here's one of the living fossils, the coelacanth. Was considered a transitional form between fish and amphibians. And then they found a live one near London in 1938, another one off the coast of Madagascar in 1952, and it looked exactly like the fossil that's supposed to be an ancient, prehistoric, extinct, transitional fossil between fish and amphibians. Oops, I guess that was wrong too. The mollusks. To zoologists, the discovery of the Galathea expedition to the extraordinary deep-sea mollusk will seem even more incredible than the famous discovery in recent times of Latimeria, the living coelacanth. The newfound mollusk represents a class that existed in the Cambrian, Devonian periods of the Paleozoic and was supposed to become extinct about 280 million years ago. And then they found a live Neopilina galathei, another live fossil. Dr. Carl Werner theorized, and he was trying to decide whether evolution or creation was true, theorized that if he found, well, living organisms, a lot of them look very similar to ancient fossils. So he decided that if the living creature looks very much like the fossil, then creation is true. Little or no change over time. If there's a lot of change over time, then evolution is true. So he's written about this in Creation magazine. He's found fossils of every major invertebrate animal, phylum, most vertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, found in dinosaur layers look the same as the modern forms. Paleontologists have 432 mammal species in the dinosaur layers. Every major plant division also appears in the dinosaur rock layers. And so here is the fossil of the horseshoe crab and the living horseshoe crab below. Do they look significantly different? I don't think so. Feather stars, the fossil up above, the living feather star from down below. And by the way, did you know that about 95% of all the fossils preserved on the earth today are marine fossils? You ever wonder why that's the case? Or maybe you didn't even know that was the case, but I think we know why that's the case. As Ken Ham says, if there had ever been a worldwide flood, we would find billions of dead things covered by rock layers, buried underwater, suddenly buried underwater, and in fact that's what we find. And that's why so many of the fossils are marine fossils. Vestigial organs. At one point, evolutionists believed there was evidence of more than 100 vestigial organs, 180 in the year 1890, like the tonsils, adenoids, appendix. Evidence of human evolution because we've evolved and we no longer need those organs that, but we still have them, so leftovers of evolutionary processes. Now, the list of vestigial organs is 0. So much for that argument. Embryonic recapitulation. Drawings of Ernst Haeckel to the left. Still used in some biology textbooks as proof of evolution. All of these creatures from left to right, it's fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, hog, calf, rabbit, and human. So the three on the right side, human in the early stage, and then a little bit later and a little bit later. So we look a lot alike in the top layer, the earliest stage. We look a lot like the fish, the salamander, the calf, etc. And then we diverge as we develop in our mother's womb, and then even more divergent in the bottom layer. That's what they say. So they thought that our evolutionary development was summarized in the development of the embryo. The fancy phrase was ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Our development inside the womb is a rehearsal of the evolutionary stages that we went through to come from some primordial creature to being a human being. Then they discovered that Haeckel's drawings were not accurate. Modern biology now rejects his theory. They're not these embryos are not all at the same stage. And he doctored the drawings. So here are the actual drawings compared to the doctored drawings. The top row is Haeckel's drawings. The bottom row is, in fact, what they look like in using electron microscopes to take pictures of these creatures in their mother's wombs. So he messes with that. And yet modern, I always ask my students to tell my students about this in my Old Testament classes, and I ask them, how many of you have ever seen these drawings used to support evolution? And There are always some students that raise their hands, so it's still used today. Part 3, lack of evolution. National Geographic, 1981, photographed a roach fossil alleged to be 300 million years old. The article states roaches have changed but little since their debut over 320 million years ago. Okay, I guess evolution is selective. It works for some and not for others. National Geographic in 1977, mosquito, ant, and mantis preserved in amber. 40 million year old insects appear identical to those today. Imagine that. They haven't changed. They admit it. Since the light year is the distance traveled by light in 1 year, and we can see such galaxies, does this mean that the universe is very old? Universe is thought to be at least 10 times bigger than the distance that light could have traveled since the Big Bang, so even Big Bang cosmology has problems. So come and listen to Danny Faulkner if you're in the Austin area on February 22. New wood from actively, carbon-14 used to be thought to prove evolution to be true. Now it's carbon-14 dating is very much a friend of young Earth creationism, as is the whole realm of dinosaur fossils. New wood from actively growing trees has been dated by carbon-14 dating to be 10,000 years old. Well, how can it be in use today and yet be 10,000 years old? Mortar from the Oxford Castle in England, built about 800 years ago, was dated by carbon-14 to be 7,370 years old. So there's some problems with some of these. Freshly killed seals were tested by carbon-14 and found to be 1,300 years old. But they were just killed. Living mollusks, dated by carbon-14 at 2,300 years old. They're living, they die, they're tested. How can they have been alive days ago and be dated at 2,300 years old? Stuart Piggott, British archaeologist, reported radiocarbon tests on a sample of charcoal, indicated a date of 2600 BC. Compelling archaeological evidences called for a date about 1,000 years later. There are lots of these problems. Here are a few more of them that are indicated. In fact, still some more. Lava rocks formed in 1800 and 1801, dated by potassium-argon method as being between 160 million years and 3 billion years old. So the geometric clock started in 1800, but they found them by this method, which is even more volatile than carbon-14, to be at least 160 million years old. I don't get that. Wood buried in a lava flow, dated 45,000 years old, while potassium-argon dated the basalt in which it was found at 45 million years old. There's something wrong with this picture. No source of coal has yet been found that lacks carbon-14. The RATE project was done by a lot of ICR scientists and others. They tested 10 different samples of coal from the Penn State University coal bank that the U.S. government holds. The coal samples were supposed to be between 30 million years old and 300 million years old. And so some of the coal, because it came from lower layers, was supposed to be 10 times as old as the coal at the top layer. They had samples tested, and all the coal samples came back at roughly the same age, and they all had amounts of carbon-14 in them. And they're supposed to have been 30 to 300 million years old, but there should not be a single molecule of carbon-14 that is detectable after the coal is 100,000 years old. So how do they get any carbon-14 if it's really that old? And the answer is, it's really not that old. They also sent diamonds to the same accelerator mass spectrometer in Vienna, Austria, which is one of the world's finest testing tools for that, and they found carbon-14 in diamonds. And the reason why that's even more remarkable is because diamonds are supposed to be primordial, according to the evolutionary time scale, between 1 and 3 billion years old. And diamonds are one of the hardest substances on Earth, virtually impermeable to contamination. So whenever these tests come back and they find carbon-14, the evolutionists all say, well, there was contamination. It wasn't part of the original coal sample. Well, diamonds don't admit any contamination, so that shoots that theory. Let's skip that one. The Neanderthal genome, published in 2010. According to this new paper, the Neanderthal was fully human, and a lot of secular scientists as well as creationists think that Neanderthal is a species, a fully human species. Other frauds, Ramapithecus was actually supposed to be a transitional humanoid, now known to be an orangutan. Piltdown Man, hoax based on a human skull cap and an orangutan's jaw. Nebraska Man was reconstructed based on the single tooth of a pig. Java Man, now regarded as fully human. Australopithecus africanus, an ape. All of these supposedly transitional fossils between apes and man were either 100% ape or 100% man and not transitional at all. Peking Man, now human, classified as human. Homo habilis never existed, but was pieced together by several different, with remains from several different creatures. Homo erectus, now considered fully human. The result is not a single transitional fossil showing a missing link between apes and man. There will be fossils that they'll claim are transitional fossils because they have to have that evidence to lend some plausibility to Darwinian evolution, but there's nothing that's unambiguously transitional between ape and human being. So remember Charles Darwin, the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the earth must be truly enormous. Origin of species. Remember Haldane's dilemma from earlier. So what about humans and chimpanzees? Francis Collins, in his book, The Language of God, I bought it and read it, claimed that humans and chimpanzees have 98% identical DNA. That's been shot out of the water. So a suggestion that humans and chimpanzees are 99% or 98% identical in their genome is a myth. Chimp genome is 13% larger. 6.4% of our genes don't show up in the chimpanzee gene. The chimp Y chromosome is only 70% similar to the human. At 96% the same, and they're not that close, that amounts to DNA information equal to 500-page books, or 120 million base pairs that are different. And I will admit, a chimpanzee has some structural similarities to a human being. Got a skull that encases the brain, it's got 2 eyes, 2 ears. You would think that if we think in terms of computer programming, God would use some of the same programs that made 2 ears in a human being will work slightly modified to create 2 ears in a chimpanzee. Same with the jaw and the spine and the limbs. So there's some of God's design used in more than one place, right? So that makes some sense to me. Stephen Gould, I think this is the exact same quotation from earlier. William Dembski and Paddle Pond. Dembski, proponent of intelligent design in old Earth, admits that young Earth creationists have the strongest exegetical position. That's one of the reasons why I started with Genesis 1. Paddle Pond admits that the most straightforward understanding of Genesis is that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 solar days. Secular periodical. I appreciate the honesty there. Occasionally you get that. Paintings on the walls of the Chauvet Cave in France show an advanced stage of some art found in 1994, carbon dated to 30,000 years ago. Such sophisticated artworks, they say, though, did not appear until 15,000 years later. This is interesting. Don Batten put together this paper called 101 Evidences for the Young Age of the Earth and the Universe. 90% of all such evidence, there are more clocks to this universe and this Earth we live in than carbon-14 dating and potassium-argon dating and so on. And I have about 15 of them listed in part 4 of that little book, In the Beginning God. 90% of them are clearly young Earth. So for instance, a supernova is formed about every 26 years in the universe, visible through advanced microscopes. But we only have about 200 supernovas that are discoverable by the best of our telescopes. 200 supernovas, when there's one formed every 26 years, there should be many, many more supernovas out there in the universe than we're able to see, consistent with the young age of the universe, not with the old age of the universe. And there are 14 others of them in part 4. I would recommend you get that title, Google it. I think you can get this article at creation.com. CMI International, Creation Ministries International, is a creation organization, one of the major ones located out of Atlanta, Georgia. And Don Batten works with CMI. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock again, 11:37. So we start at 11, we go to 12, right?
Yes, yes.
So we'll be able to stop, I think, 10 or 15 minutes before the end and do some more questions, but you can learn all kinds of things on Google, and this is one of the fascinating articles. I was at a conference where they talked about this, and I said, well, what about the other 10%? Are those supportive of the great age of the Earth? And they said, no, those are arguments that you can use. Those are data points that are used by both old Earth and young Earth people, so they're somewhat ambiguous. And so this is 101 evidences. Here's the geological column. Exists in its entirety, I bet most of you didn't know this, nowhere on Earth. In spite of the nice charts that geologists have prepared, actually there is one place those columns do exist, and that's in biology textbooks written by evolutionists. Other than that, they don't exist anywhere. 80 to 85% of the Earth's land surface doesn't even have 3 geological periods in the correct order. By the way, did you ever wonder why, if you look at a picture of the Grand Canyon and all the layers, ever wonder why the layers are completely flat? Layer upon layer, it seems like there's no variation. And if there had been layers exposed to the elements for many, even a few years, or hundreds of thousands of years, wouldn't the contour be uneven up and down because of the erosion of rain and flowing water and the wind and dust and so on? And yet the fact that layer upon layer is flat, one on top of the other, until at the end of the flood, a gush of water runs through and carves out this river canyon so you can take a look at it from the side. Those indicate that the layers of the Grand Canyon were laid down rapidly rather than over the course of millions of years, because there's no evidence of erosion between the layers. Something missing. I guess these are the fossils that we have at these developed stages, but the alleged ancestors of these dinosaurs and the ancestors of the ancestors. Notice the number in these boxes to the left of the right-hand column, how many fossils there are that indicate a common ancestor or some common ancestors. We've got lots of numbers in the right-hand column, but nothing prior to it. Something is missing. Now we're onto a few random topics. If the Big Bang resulted in the spinning of matter in one direction, then all matter will continue to spin in that direction. Why do Venus and Uranus in our solar system spin the opposite way? Why do 8 of 91 moons in our solar system spin backward? The evolutionists have no explanation for that. Why do entire galaxies spin the opposite way that most of them do? Richard Dawkins said that backwardly wired retina was an indication of poor design of our eyes. And then he later on admits, oops, he says, looking back on these books, I realized that the evidence for evolution is nowhere explicitly set out. Seemed like a good gap to close. One of his favorite examples is the allegedly backwardly wired retina, a favorite example of supposed bad design that shows evolution rather than intelligent design. In reality, as Levin and Ryback explain, just a few years ago, the retina is revealed as an optimal structure designed for improving the sharpness of images. The fundamental features of the array of glial cells are revealed as an optimal structure designed for preserving the acuity of images in the human retina. Displays a crucial role in vision quality in humans and in other species. So I guess Dawkins needs to quit using that argument. Record of sudden appearances of species in the fossil record happens quickly. Some of you know the phrase the Cambrian explosion. That's the rock layer where all forms of life appear. Below that, almost nothing, and then all of a sudden, many billions of different species appear in that Cambrian level. We don't have the gradual level of increasingly complex creatures the higher up we go on the rock layers. Lack of intermediate species we talked about. Dr. David Raup, Field Museum of Natural History, Chicago. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. I don't know how you can have fewer than 0, but there are some fossils that they claim are transitional and really are not. Nearly all the great mountain areas of the world have been found to have fossils from marine fossils near their summits, as Morrison Whitcomb wrote in the Genesis flood. Did you know that there are hundreds of flood traditions in every part of the world, in eastern and western hemispheres, Europe, Asia, Australia, East Indies, Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, etc., etc.? Hundreds of flood traditions. You think maybe that's an indication that there might have been an original worldwide flood? Polystrate tree fossils, that's also one of the examples I have in my book. It is not possible. A polystrate fossil is a fossil of a tree that is thrust through multiple layers of sedimentation. And the idea of the evolutionist is that these layers of sedimentation were laid down over millions of years, or at least hundreds of thousands of years. Why don't you have the top of the tree rotting while it's waiting for the next layer of sedimentation? Not possible, is it? It is not possible that polystrate fossils were buried gradually over thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, because the top part of any tree would have rotted away before it could be protected by sediment. Polystrate fossils point to rapid burial and are really evidence for the global flood recorded in the Bible. Gigantic gap between one-celled microorganisms and invertebrate, according to Scott Hughes. No transitions between invertebrates and vertebrates. No certain evidence of evolutionary advance from fishes to amphibians. No evidence of evolutionary advances from amphibians to reptiles, Scott Hughes says. No certain transitional forms between reptiles and mammals. No evolutionary links between reptiles and birds. Archaeopteryx, acknowledged to have been a true bird. No transitional forms between man and supposed ape-like ancestors. Even bacteria, they produce a new generation every 30 minutes, which is approximately 400,000 times faster than human generations. Now, if evolution were true, wouldn't you see bacteria demonstrating some dramatic changes over the course of many thousands of generations? French zoologist Grasset found no change in bacteria after the equivalent of 3.5 million years of human generations. French biologist Remy Chauvin, mutation could not be considered the motor of evolution. 2010 was the 100th anniversary of genetic investigation of fruit flies. Fruit flies have a short generation period, only 4 pairs of chromosomes, prime testing ground for evolution. The spectacular effects of homeobox gene mutations were first seen in Drosophila. Early in the history of genetics, carriers of some of these mutations certainly qualify as monsters, though without much hope. Professor of Human Origins and evolutionist, George Mason University. There is a popular image of human evolution that you'll find all over the place. On the left of the picture, there's an ape. On the right, a man. Between the two is a succession of figures that become ever more like humans. Our progress from ape to human looks so smooth, so tidy. It's such a beguiling image that even the experts are loath to let it go, but it is an illusion. And he's an evolutionist who's saying that. Lyle Watson. Modern apes, for instance, seem to have sprung out of nowhere. They have no yesterday, no fossil record in the origin of modern humans. Of upright, naked, tool-making, big-brain beings is, if we are to be honest with ourselves, an equally mysterious matter. Well, not to Christians who believe the Bible in the opening chapters of Genesis especially. Here he's talking about the evolution of humans from apes, are products of our imagination. I underline that. Takahata, even with DNA sequence data, we have no direct access to the process of evolution, so objective reconstruction of the vanished past can be achieved only by creative imagination. We're winding downhill. Australopithecines, irrevocably removed from human evolution. Summary of hominid fossil evidence. Several thousand hominid fossils have been documented, many hundreds of human fossils, numerous fossils of extinct apes, nothing in between. This is my last slide. What is an evangelical? Lloyd Jones, probably an Anglican, conservative Anglican, with a similar respect for Scripture that people, Southern Baptists, LCMS, Assemblies of God, some denominations like that hold. He says, if you do not accept this history, that is Genesis, and prefer to believe that man's body developed as a result of an evolutionary process, you are still left with the question of how to explain Eve. For the Bible is very particular as to the origin of Eve. All who accepted any form of theory of evolution in the development of man completely failed to account for the being, origin, and existence of Eve. And that takes me to the end of this PowerPoint, and time for questions, at least 11:48, so we got maybe 10 minutes, if you have some.
Here, Ruth, I have the microphone here, and then Erica.
Could you say that we have devolution rather than evolution?
In many ways, things are going in the opposite direction. Yeah, we're not getting better and better. Evolutionists will say in a closed system where you have lots of energy, in that closed system you could evolve into higher forms of life with lots of energy and a limited interference from the outside. But that's actually an example of intelligent design, because it takes a designer to create that closed system. So yeah, we're sort of going in the opposite direction. And there are lots of jokes about that too, but in some ways, the breakdown of civilization, the Christian aspects of our culture are slipping away from us, and we're seeing more and more radical ideas out there in the public arena than ever before. Society is getting worse and worse, I think, rather than better. Actually, Billy Graham was right years ago when he said, is the world getting better or is it getting worse? And he said both. And there are some really fabulous developments, but even this phone, this smartphone, fools people into thinking because phones are better, cars are better, computers are better, therefore people are getting better. And well, the amoral things that aren't capable of choosing right and wrong can improve, but things that have a conscience, things that make moral choices, they are getting both better and worse. Indeed, yes.
I've heard the argument made that creation scientists, because they're not being published in professionally evaluated and peer-reviewed journals, and they're only being published by Answers in Genesis and ICR and CMI and other places, that it's not real research. And can you speak a little bit to the censoring of creation scientists and their work?
Well, if you want to see an interesting movie on that, get the movie Expelled, which illustrates how creationist thinkers are basically being run out of the universities all over our country. I was in Oxford many years ago, and I attended a session on C.S. Lewis, and one of the retired professors of divinity made the comment, you know, there's not a single young earth creationist in all of the theology faculty of Oxford University. I kept my mouth shut, but what I could have said, I can easily explain that. Because you stack the search committees to fill faculty positions with people that believe in evolution, and so anybody that doesn't agree with you is automatically ruled out. Same thing that happens in publications. if I wrote something or a scientist wrote something that supported a young Earth creationist position, submitted it to Science or Nature or any of the other publications that are known, National Geographic, for supporting evolution, they wouldn't be allowed to be published. So that there is a censoring that is, in fact, going on, and so creationists have to publish their own things elsewhere and create their own periodicals. Brian Thomas does document this soft tissue from dinosaurs in the secular literature, so there are some places where some of this does get published. But by and large, the reason why creationists don't get published in secular literature is because they blackball anybody. And I've seen that in theology too. I actually once tried to get an article published that defended the Mosaic authorship of the book of Deuteronomy, and this prestigious periodical rejected it because they said, you know, it looks like you're trying to support the Mosaic authorship of Deuteronomy, which I was. So I rewrote it and took that out of it, and then they accepted it for publication. And I mean, that made me sick, but I did get it published eventually, but still, that's the kind of thing that happens in theological circles as well as in scientific circles. You got a question? We'll take that one first.
Okay.
Yes.
Wondered if you'd speak a little more. You had suggested some items where you were using diamonds to dating things. My understanding that diamonds are they're terrifically hard and all that, but they're not necessarily immune. And when you get like 1,500 degrees, you know, way down in the middle of a coal mine or something, they melt. Are they good to try to formulate carbon-14 into saying how old this diamond is? It doesn't sound like it makes sense to me.
Yeah, well, I guess I would refer you to the RATE project. RATE stands for Radioactivity in the Age of the Earth. Conference was held at the end of their research. They did a lot of different projects, and the coal and diamond samples were one of them. So I guess I can't comment on your specific point, but diamonds are a very, very hard substance. When they saved the coal samples, sent the coal samples to the lab, likewise with the diamond samples, they were extremely careful to make sure that there was no contamination. And it seems to me that the argument that there's contamination in both the coal and diamond samples are an argument of desperation, because the evolutionist doesn't want to admit that the carbon-14 is there naturally in the coal or the diamond, because that ruins his theory that these are really tens of millions of years old, or hundreds of millions, or even in the case of diamonds, billions of years old. There are more popular publications about the RATE project, as well as very technical scientific manuals. If you're capable of the technical scientific ones, that stuff is available, but I'm a theologian, not a scientist, so I'm not sure I can address your question carefully or wisely. Did you have a question here?
Wait. Here.
You mentioned how evolution is not really backed up by any evidence, because all the evidence is basically wrong. So in our schools and in just like our everyday like internet and wise, are we basically being lied to?
Well, I remember Abraham Lincoln once being quoted as saying, "You can't trust everything that's on the internet." So I think I saw that on the internet somewhere. Did you see that too? Yeah. So there's a lot of good science that is happening. I mean, there are evolutionists in our biology faculty in Austin, but one of them admitted to me once that it's very rare that any kind of a Darwinian idea comes into the kind of research that they do, where they're working with the experimental method and they're testing, say, soil samples or water samples for contamination and what might be the cause of this contamination, doing some studies for the city of Austin and the like. Evolutionary theory, I think, adds little or nothing to the research process, so that a lot of what scientists produce, even if if they are evolutionists, can still be valuable. So yeah, I would say you're not being lied to by a lot of people, but some of them are publishing really good stuff. Some of them are publishing things that are ambiguous at best, and some things are very starkly evolutionary. And I guess we have to be able to think critically, and sometimes to write a note to one of the scholars at CMI International or ICR and say, okay, this is what I ran into, what do you think? And is this correct when evolutionists say this? And then get some feedback from people who are experts in that field. Is that an answer? Make sense? Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Between the relationship between creation and the gospel, if someone rejects what God said regarding creation, how is it also a rejection of the very gospel itself?
Well, the second presentation made some of that case. If there is no creation by God, then there probably was no fall into sin. Therefore, we are not in need of redemption. Therefore, Christ didn't have to come and die and redeem us. And the whole message of the New Testament, which is built upon the foundations of the book of Genesis, is pretty much irrelevant. Some of the, trying to remember the name of this, America's best defender of Christianity is a philosopher who works at, I think, Biola University, and he had a famous debate with an evolutionist that's available on YouTube, I believe, and the evolutionist said, came to the logical conclusion, if everything happened by evolution, that does undercut not just a biblical understanding of origins, but even the gospel message itself. So they are very much related, and we ought not to adopt the position that, well, let's just focus on Jesus and not worry about origins. They are connected.
Any other questions? Do you have 2 minutes or so? Any other questions? Okay, Leon?
Do you have any information on what's going on in our Concordia University system? Are we correcting those false teachers?
I wish that were the case. It's a separate issue from one Concordia to the other. Probably the best Concordia in terms of creation science is Concordia Ann Arbor. Pretty close to them, I think, is Concordia University, Wisconsin. Then there are schools like ours in Austin. We have some evolutionists in our science faculty. We have creationists in our theology faculty and elsewhere. They tolerate us, I guess, so to speak, and I don't have control over their contracts over there, but I bring in this annual creation speaker. I teach creation in my classrooms, and so the creation message is out there, and it's front and center, and it's rather bold. But there are other Concordias where I was told I asked a professor from Concordia Portland, are there any, because I was trying to build the membership of the Society of Creation among Concordia faculties, because I think there are a lot of others out there but are afraid to say what they believe because the biologists on their faculty aren't. And he said he didn't know of a single one at Concordia Portland. And I'm not sure where others are. Concordia Seward, somebody told me that there wasn't a single young earth creationist in the science faculty. Now that they might be all old earth creationists there, I don't know. But that's 10 years ago that I heard that, so has that happened or changed or not? You might be interested, there is a Denver affiliate of our Society of Creation that's hosting a conference in May in Denver on the LCMS and creation. And so I'm going to be speaking at that. I think one of our Concordia Seminary St. Louis faculty is speaking. A couple of district presidents are speaking. We're going to talk about creation and evolution in the Concordia University and Concordia Seminary campuses. So I guess nobody fully knows the status at each of the Concordias. I mean, I don't know it fully at my own, because I haven't gone to every faculty member and said, okay, what do you believe about this, this, and this, and then write it down. So I don't know fully, but I know generally kind of where we stand. What's happening at denominational level? Well, one thing that's happening is that there is a resolution that's being proposed to the LCMS convention this summer. Hopefully it gets to the floor committee and to the floor, identifying not only young earth creationism as our official doctrinal position, but also stating explicitly that the days of Genesis 1 are solar days, 24-hour days. Because nowhere in our convention resolutions do we ever define what the word day means. Well, back in 1932, when the brief statement was adopted, they talked about days, and there's hardly anybody that questioned what a day meant in 1930 or 32. I forget which of the dates it is. Do you know? 32, okay. But today, people will say, well, the LCMS convention uses the word day, but it could mean long periods of time. So there's hopefully a convention resolution that'll be at the floor, will be adopted. Young earth creationism is our historic position, but we haven't adopted that as the official LCMS position. We have, in many convention resolutions, said Darwinian evolution or neo-Darwinism is wrong and God created. But we haven't been in the last few decades more explicit about distinguishing old earth from young earth and young earth from theistic evolution. I think we need to be more bold and more upfront with that position. And that would help us at the university level with hiring practices.
Did you have a question? Here. Okay, short answer. 1203, yeah.
You were saying something about bacteria not...
There's a new generation of bacteria every 30 minutes. So in 300 minutes, you can have 10 generations, which, if that happened among human beings, 10 generations would be 300 years. So if you can't see evolution in bacteria over hundreds or thousands of generations, it's pretty clear that evolution isn't happening there where it should be easy to see it happen by mutation. If it's not happening there, it's probably not happening anywhere else. That's the...
What about the
Bacteria
bacteria that are jumping from species to species?
that are jumping from species to species.
I guess as far as disease is concerned.
Some bacteria do change, but it's my understanding, and this is just off the top of my head, that it changes, they become resistant to certain drugs by the loss of genetic information rather than the gaining of new genetic information. So that they no longer have a feature that the drug worked against, because that has been lost through natural selection. Creationists do believe in natural selection, but they don't believe in Darwinian evolution. I mean, there are certain animals that die out because they are endangered species, and we do have species that become extinct from time to time. Okay? Maybe better make that the last question, and I do still have those 4 copies of my book on C.S. Lewis if anybody's interested. But the other one is gone, and the little pamphlet about Concordia University, Texas, I gave away too. Okay? So, instructions, meal prayer, or whatever.
Okay, let's give him a hand.